All right, internal controls is something that I like because obviously I did internal audit, which is a subset of audits, but that's what I kind of did in mine. So internal controls feeds everything. It's not just internal audit, but the internal controls are what we're going to be looking at, and it really stems behind the whole audit process. So what we're going to start with now is going to feed into the flow of everything. So what we've done up till now is kind of the background leading up to why we're going to do it. Today we're going to do internal controls. Chapter 6 is audit planning and understanding risk, which is what your next case is going to be. It's actually about controlling revenue. And what you guys are going to do is go into it and identify the risks that could be there, and are there any risk involved in the case. So I actually have that case for you. That one is not in your book. So that's what Chapter 6 is. So we go up first. I kind of like talking about internal controls and then going backwards and talking about identifying the risks, because I think it's helpful to know about the controls that you're looking at, and then looking at identifying the risk versus the other way around. That's my preference. So don't do that. All right, so what are we talking about when we're talking about internal controls? Hopefully, we already know this process that we're looking at, by which management's already put in place, hopefully, all right, designed to provide reasonable assurance that the information that we're providing is going to I tell my financial students, provide reasonable assurance that our financial statements are accurate. That's what internal controls are going to do. The definition here are that provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of objectives relating to operating, reporting, and compliance. All right. The operating, reporting, and compliance leads to the financial statements. All right. So internal controls, we're getting to those financial statements. Control objectives. We're going to be looking at a couple different things. All right. We got the control objectives and we got sub-objectives when we're going in here. And areas of reporting, there's a couple different things. We got the top level, and then we're going to drill down a little bit lower into the detail where we're looking at things like, are goods shipped? Okay, are they shipped at the end of the month, or are they not shipped until the first of the month? All right, because obviously then we can't bill them. Are we looking to see our invoices accurately recorded? Which is one of the things I believe I already talked about, how that can be mismatched sometimes if we're not careful with the three-way match. Are authorized sales only the ones that are being done, or are other sales happening? All right. Are accounts receivables safeguarded? Are we being careful with some of those things? So those are some of the objectives that we're looking at. All right, there was an act passed called the Foreign Corrupt Acts back in 1977. This was in practice to Americans paying bribes. I thought, and kickbacks to foreign countries. So it passed basically saying it's illegal to make the payments of bribes to foreign officials. It's illegal to make bribes to American officials, but where this came into play was in different countries have different ethics, all right? It is not considered unethical in some countries to make payments to officials to get things done. I had a friend who adopted a child from a different country, and he said he could not believe the way that his money had to be flowed. Like, he paid the adoption agency here, but then the different money that he paid to the different officials in that country was just surprising. The checks that were made out to the country, and to specific individuals in the country. He said that they had to be direct payments, but they got their child. So it was a different type of adoption, and he said to him it felt like he was making bribes. He doesn't know that he was making bribes, but it wasn't an adoption that you would go through in the States. But he also wouldn't have gotten a child in the States, and he got a child, so he was happy. But he was just making a comment when we were doing his taxes one year. Okay, so when we look at controls, we've already talked about a couple of these. Preventive and detective, we talked about the fact that preventive are always better, okay? If we prevent it from happening, that's better than detective. Preventive or something like segregation of duties, which I also believe I mentioned is my #1 control, because if you aren't segregating from the very beginning, you're going to have problems, right? detective is something like bank recs. Bank reconciliations are very important. Individually and personally, we've gotten away from them the way that they used to be done because we can get online and check our balances like we never could. But in businesses, you still got to do those because you should have different people doing the bank rec than those that are writing the checks. But those are only going to find the problem after the fact. So that's a detective control. Corrective is something like on the IT side where you do like a backup when something goes wrong. We're doing that right now at the college. We had a problem where that sounds like they did it, where we had a problem with what's called our P drive. Our P drive is where all faculty and staff can store our files if we're not using a flash drive. Okay, or when we do use a flash drive and we tend to break them, like me, we back them up, and where you should back them up. And when you're using email and you store old emails, it goes to the P drive. The P drive went away. Just went away somewhere. They don't know where. So they are backing it up, but even though once they restored it, some files are still missing. So anything in my email that I put on the P drive and not on the email server is gone. And I kept it there because I only have so much space on the email server. So things that I don't need to get to at home, I put on the P drive. And I don't have those. All right, and then the control overlap is one that we have not talked about. Okay, the control overlap are just looking at things that complement each other so they function well together, or they're redundant. Okay, they're happening in more than one place, or they're compensating, meaning they reduce the risk of an existing weakness. So there are all types of controls that we're going to look at. All right, these are going to be nice and slow. Okay, so the controls of an internal environment. So we got the control environment, risk assessment, the control activity, information systems, and then monitoring activities. All right, so each one of these is going to be looked at separately when you're going out and looking at the internal audit environment. All right, so you're going to look at, first of all, the control environment and the risk assessment. The risk assessment, like I said, we got a chapter on that. We'll go backwards on and look at. Then we'll look at the control activities and go forward. So the control environment, I don't have the patience to go slow, so we'll do that. All right, the control environment. First of all, is the company, now control, if you think about it, that's this top down, the tone at the top that we kind of talked about earlier. The control environment, is there a commitment to integrity and ethical values? Does the company have that? So from the controls at the top, do we have that already in place? Does the board of directors exhibit independence? Are they there from the management? Are they enforcing and encouraging strong internal controls? You can usually determine that right from the very beginning. Because when you go in right away and you start talking about narratives and controls and segregation of duties, you can see on the faces of the top right away if they're going and their eyes are rolling. Because right away you're going to be a pain in the rear end to them. That means this stuff is just paper. All right. All right, do they have an effective structure including reporting lines? Do they have that structure set up? Are they committed to attracting good employees? That's very important. High turnover is usually not a very good sign of a good company. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad company, but it's not usually a good sign. There are reasons for turnover. But in general, when you see a high turnover, that's not usually a good sign, because you got to ask yourself, why are people continuing to leave? Now, there are some environments where there are. In the newspaper industry and small towns especially, when you're looking at that pay line that kind of falls at that 30,000 and below, you're going to reporters and the clerical staff, that's going to turn over, and that's not something that we're talking about. But when you're looking at the management and the HR staff and the payroll that are up, that should not be a big turnover spot. You don't want to see the IT staff constantly turning over, or the payroll. All right, holding employees accountable for internal control responsibilities. All right, so making my little notes on page 254. There is an org chart, and I have it to put up here if I know how to push the correct buttons in the right order. And this just is just a quick example, and I'll have to blow it up a little bit. And in order to see it, just kind of to show you what we're talking about when we're looking at a good org chart with good. Now, obviously, this org chart right here is not a small company. All right, so, and we're going to talk about small companies at the very end of the chapter and how do you handle small companies. But this one's big right from the beginning because it says shareholders and board of directors. Now, you can have shareholders and board of directors in smaller companies as well, but so shareholders, board of directors, here's your audit committee, here's your internal audit. But then here's your top line. So right here at the top, you got 4 vice presidents and a controller. Even if you wanted to cut out 3 vice presidents and make this company smaller, what's under the controller and the vice president is kind of what's the important part because there's nobody under the other 3. All right? Notice there's a cashier and a credit manager, and then you have 2 other people under the cashier. Okay? If you can't have 2 other people under the cashier, then you got to look at the cashier and the credit manager. Then the person above this, above these 2, has a bigger role. Because right now the cashier is reviewing what's happening here with the cash disbursements and the cash receipts. So if there isn't these 2 people because you're too small, that means the cashier is doing it. So if the cashier is doing it, that means this person now has to become reviewing it because it's not necessarily the credit manager's job to come into play. Same thing when you come over here under the controller. All of a sudden, oh, I didn't see that line. Okay, the vice president does have something over here. All right, the controller, you got planning, forecasting, budgeting, and then you got your chief accountant, which has a whole bunch of stuff underneath them. All right. This is where it gets really big. And that's where a lot of companies just don't have the staff to have all these different individuals under the chief accountant. But what you have to do and what you have to be, reports and statistics, that's not always there. All right, there isn't a reports and statistics person. If we move that up a little bit, you just have to look at the different jobs when you're looking at segregation of duties. You have a factory ledger and a general ledger. Well, that might be one person. Inventory records, accounts receivable, accounts payable, timekeeping. Well, honestly, all those could very easily go right into the general accounting. You might not have a cost accountant. You might not have a billing, and accounts receivable, and accounts payable, and an operations control. Those could very easily be absorbed. But your accounts receivable and your accounts payable should be different. Right? Unless you just can't have it, which also happens. Exactly. And I was both. In my first job, I was both. I was accounts receivable, accounts payable, and the person that made the bank deposits. Okay, which can happen, but the only problem that was the problem was nobody then was over top of that. I was also the computer person. That was all bigger. I mean, I basically just could. I was 23, so that was helpful, I guess, because I wasn't vicious-minded. But I could have done anything I wanted to do. When you got the computer behind you, accounts receivable, accounts payable, and I pretty much did all the bank deposits, that's not a good combination of things to do. I had one person above me, and they just didn't check anything. I was like, okay. So you just got to be careful in your flow and know that it's just not, this is a very big company, and that's just not that normal from a middle-sized company standpoint. Especially you just said you're with the Archdiocese, you're not that big. Come on. It's a lot quicker in the other room. There we go. All right. All right, so risk assessment. So a few things on what you will also do next week a little bit more. All right, so the risk assessment has to very specifically identify what assessments you're going to be looking at. What are you trying to do with your audit so that you can go in and validate the risk? Like what objects are you looking at? What are you going to look at? Identify and analyze the risk to determine how you can manage them. So by going and look at that org chart, where did you see a problem? Okay, I saw a problem because the accounts payable and the accounts receivable person are the same person. Well, what can we do to mitigate that? Yeah, it's a problem, but what if the person above them was doing this? Oh, well, that's helpful. Okay, they're reviewing every check that is written and every check that comes in the door. That might be overkill on what comes in the door. But if they had processes in place, then that's going to be a risk that's going to be mitigated. consider how fraud could relate to it, and then identify any other changes that could impact the internal control environment. Okay, now control activities are policies and procedures that can help mitigate the risk. So we already we went through and we said, okay, here's what our risks are. So now we're going to look at those activities like I just said and see how are these control activities, such as the manager over accounts payable and accounts receivable, whatever they're doing, how can those help mitigate the risk? Because those activities then are what we're going to be able to put in our report to say, or note, so that we don't even have to increase the audit sample, that this is not necessarily a big deal. Because if we just went in and saw an org chart that was decreased in size, we'd have all sorts of problems. But then we have to list the different risks. So performance reviews, when we go through if they're doing them, and we're going through and we're saying that from the tone at the top, management's going through and looking at their employees, that's saying that, supposedly, that's saying that they care and they're looking at their employees. And I say supposedly only because they do have to be done with some type of diligence behind them. There are companies that do performance reviews and they're just a matter of checking off a piece of paper. But if performance reviews are done and they're done with some type of integrity behind them, then they're done because you're wanting to make sure people are doing a good job. Then you're going to look at transaction controls, where you're going to actually go in and you're going to look at a series of transactions that are happening in the area that you're looking at. Are they occurring the way that they should? So again, if we're looking at accounts receivable or accounts payable, and we're making sure that they're being signed off by, or they're being checked off by the manager above accounts payable, then we take a sample of those control activities. What physical controls are in place? All right, well, if we're talking about, here we could be talking about controls over checks and writing checks. If we're in a very small environment and we're trying to say that the same person that writes the checks is also the same person that controls the checks, but they can't sign the checks. Or we could say that the same person that writes the checks, controls the checks, and has and can stamp the checks, but they don't have access to the check stamping machine. Someone else has the key. So I can do all that, but unless you go get the check stamping machine, I can't stamp it. So therefore, there's a control that I can't go write my own checks unless you help me. Then we can write checks together. But, so what physical controls? Segregation of duties is a good example. Again, there was an example in your book about a golf club, and they talk about the fact that over time, it was a warehouse, and over time there was slowly some golf clubs that went missing in the warehouse. And the individual that was working in the warehouse was also responsible for, I don't want to get it wrong, was also responsible for, how many pages could I be? Oh. 257, I went too far, that's one. He was also responsible for the discrepancy, so he was worried, he didn't know why they were disappearing. He just knew that there were golf clubs that were disappearing. So he went in and changed the inventory records to agree with the count that was in the inventory. That way, he wasn't going to be in trouble. Well, what happened over time is golf clubs kept disappearing. And he kept making the change, but then when they went in to do a physical count, they had a drastic difference in the golf club versus the inventory records. So they ended up with what considered to be a gigantic difference in loss. And so if they just would have had a segregation of duties between the person that controlled the warehouse and the person that was able to control the physical inventory in the computer. So that guy was in charge of the warehouse, that's great. But he should not have been able to make physical changes to the inventory online, because that shouldn't have been his job too. So we want to have a complete segregation of duties. So he could have custody, but he shouldn't have been able to record it. And in that example, there quite possibly could have been because it was a smaller company. So then you got to think to yourself, okay, well, how can we take two jobs that are different and cross them? He does the warehouse, and someone over here can do the recording, and then someone over here can do this job, and then he's in the warehouse, and he can do a piece of their job. And that way they're not using each other's. And then just again, you're maintaining the custody of the asset, and you got independent records. It's very important to do that, because when you can change your records, and that's why I kind of laughed with my first job. I mean, when you're the accounts receivable person, accounts payable person, and you have complete control over the computer, that's not a good combination, because now I maintained and I controlled. Okay, now it wasn't a custody of an asset because it was accounts receivable, but when money came in the door, and back then it was even worse than now, people sent cash in. And I never understood it then, but that was a long time ago. People are better, I hope, at not sending cash in with their bills, but it was a lot of cash, and I'd just sit there. I mean, and it was this tells you how long ago it was. It was where you could rent your cell phones. We were part of a computer company, but the smaller part of it was we rented cell phones. And like their monthly cell phone payment was $20, and they'd send a $20 bill in. So I'm sitting there with $20 bills coming in and just sitting in front of me, and I'd go into their account and take $20, and then I'd make the bank deposit, take it to the bank, and then I'd come in later and run computer reports. I mean, all that was just sitting right in front of me. So I had both the maintaining, the independent record, the custody of the assets. I was going to the bank. So none of it was a segregation of duties at all. It was just all duties. All right, so what are we trying to do with our overall accounting? We want to identify and record valid transactions. That's what we're trying to do. That's what we're trying to have them do, right? And then describe on a timely basis in sufficient detail what that transaction was doing. That's what we're hoping that they're trying to do. And then permit proper classification of that transaction. All right, they're hoping that they can measure the value of it and then determine the time period in which it happened. So when we're going and we're hoping that we're going in to do the audit, whoops, too many slides. The whole purpose of them entering everything in here for us to even come in and audit is that the system accurately describes what happened to them during the month. What happened for that company during the month? They bought and they sold things. How much money went in the door? How much money went out the door? What's their assets still in? Did they have valid transactions? Did it happen from September 1st to September 30th? Right. Can we go in there and post for our financial statements what actually happened during that month? This is what our objectives are, and what the auditors are hopefully going to come in and do, is come in and prove that these 5 bullet points are true. That's our job, we hope. Oops, again, too many. Okay, so now with monitoring, what we're looking for here is that the supervisors and the management are constantly reviewing what is going on, ongoing. It's not just when you come to do the audit. It's not just the 6 weeks prior to when you're coming and doing the audit. It's continuous monitoring of what's going on. So when we're looking at this from a lot of different ways. Are they reviewing and monitoring what's going on in-house? And are they looking for things like customer complaints? Are we constantly sending out invalid invoices? Are we constantly sending out or receiving complaints from the standpoint that we're not making the right payments? Are payments not coming on time? All right, are we not making payments at all? Right. So are those things happening? So what are we hearing from our customers? What are we hearing from our creditors? So what are we doing? Are we monitoring what's going on out there? And then when we're doing things, we're also looking for some type of evaluations. Right? Yes, we're doing this audit. That's what we're doing. What other audits are they doing? Are they doing any type of internal audits? Are they doing any departmental reviews? And I don't mean like you're reviewing a job performance review, which are also helpful, but are they doing any type of review internally to see that they're functioning as a group the way that they're supposed to? A lot of times that's what happens, that's what leads to reorganizations, is whether or not that department is functioning the way that it's supposed to. If you find that you're not, like that big gigantic org chart that we just saw. Okay, so maybe they do they're doing evaluation, they find out they don't need that many levels. The college is going through one right now. They actually last year just got rid of all of our presidents. We don't have presidents anymore, we have provosts. I think it's just president with the new name, but we have provost. And they used to have presidents and vice presidents. We don't have any vice presidents anymore, so they did get rid of that. I'm sure there's something else there in its place, but they did. And then now they're looking at deans and department chairs. And so what I expect from that is I expect some changes within divisions and departments. I'm not sure what. I'm kind of scared, not really sure where it's going to go. But I could see where maybe they combine some departments or they combine some divisions. And what they'll do by doing that is they could possibly eliminate a dean or a department chair. Now, department chairs don't get paid anymore to be a department chair. They teach one less class. So it's not like you get paid more. Deans, I don't know if we can really streamline any more deans because last year we went from 4 to 3. So unless they plan on taking up some 3 to 2, which we're a pretty good school to go to 2 deans, but I don't know, they can do anything they want. But that's kind of what they're looking at now. So my biggest guess from all this is they're going to combine departments is where I could see that they're going to do that. And then your divisions would be more compact. So I don't know. So that's what you're looking at. And then, so periodic audits by internal audit. But if you don't have an internal audit department, that's where you got to rely on doing it within your own departments or within your own divisions, looking at what you have set up. So what are some limits on internal controls? So now some of you guys have your slides in front of your book, but if you weren't looking at it, what would you say are limits on internal control? What's some limitations that it gives us? Can it do everything? Can it stop everything? Now I mentioned the ZZ Best last week when we were here 2 weeks ago, and someone had seen it, but I don't know, for some reason I was thinking he was sitting over here, so I don't know if anybody else has seen it. If you think about Enron, even if they had good internal controls, what happened there that would have circumvented good internal controls? Collusion. All right? When you have 2 or more people working together, you're going to get around segregation of duties. All right? So it doesn't matter that you do have, what did I say earlier about having the manager over accounts payable check every check that goes out. If the manager over accounts payable is verifying it and they're together, then it doesn't matter. If the person who writes checks in a small company, like I was mentioning, has access to everything but the check writing machine, but the person who has access to the check writing machine and that person work together, they can write as many checks as they want. So collusion is something that's very hard to circumvent. All right. That's where a lot of what you're looking at when you're talking about hiring good people and staying on top of it from a standpoint of being up at the top and watching your people and just knowing when you have good characters working for you. And the only way that management knows that is by management being out there. When management sits up in their offices and never comes out, they have no idea who's working for them. So errors, there's nothing you can do about errors. Errors are mistake. Errors happen. And so when you're doing an audit, you got to be able to tell the difference between an error and fraud. And just because it's small doesn't mean it's an error. It could still be fraud. You know, that's how right now, that's how the people are getting away with a lot of credit card fraud, is they're doing very small charges on people's credit cards. They're going to McDonald's, they're using your credit card to go to McDonald's and Burger King and McDonald's and Burger King over and over again until somebody finally figures out they're going to McDonald's and Burger King, and then they stop them and then they pick up somebody else's credit card. It's the big purchases that get people caught. So you got to be very careful. Just because it's small, you got to figure out, is it an error or is it fraud? And then even if it is fraud, is it easier for someone working in a company to blame it on an error if it's small? Oh, that was a mistake. I didn't mean to do it. So then you got to be able to figure that out. Controls, and we said this one, collusion. All right, that one is very hard. And then management may override the structure. This also happened with the Enron case. It can happen at the Tyco case. Okay, when the CEO of Tyco decided to throw his wife a birthday party, who was really going to tell him no? I mean, if you think, who was going to sit there and tell him he could not do that? Should he have been doing that? I think most people, you would hope, that were underneath him knew the company should not be paying for his wife's birthday party. But there wasn't anybody underneath him that obviously stood up and said no. There might have been some people that thought this isn't right. When I was at a company in St. Louis, that I will not name, doing a T&E audit, which is travel and entertainment, and it was, to me, the only financial audits that were fun, all right, because you got to look where people were going and see how much money they were spending. And to me, it was the ones where I actually found problems. So to me, that was fun. But it wasn't problems you got to write up and they got in trouble for. It was just you got to write up and they might have gotten in trouble inside for. But anyway, so this one I was doing, I kept looking at it, and I was with somebody else, so we got to laugh about it. And it was an internal audit, so it wasn't, we were not, unlike these, we were not reporting it to the SEC. We were reporting it inside the company. And I kept looking at it, and every trip, there were 2 people, and both two airline tickets, 2 dinners, but it was only supposed to be 1 person, 2 dinners, and the dinners were not like going to, you know, Buffalo Wild Wings. You know, they weren't the dinners that I would be probably eating out, or even just a little bit nicer if I was traveling. They were nice dinners. They were hundreds of dollars of dinners, right? There were shows on there, theater shows. If they were in Vegas, there were big shows. And then the telling thing is at the very bottom, every time they were signed by himself. He signed his own expense reports. And I'm like, well, you're not supposed to sign your own expense report. So then it took us a little bit, and we looked up. He was the head of the financial department.
Oh.
Now, he should still not be signing his own expense reports. Just because he's the top guy, the CFO should have been signing his, and I can't remember if he was the CFO. If he was, it should have been someone above him. Actually, I think he might have been. It should have been above him. Nobody said anything. When they reimbursed him, they just cut his check. That's not how it goes. But that was step, management can override the system. He signed it, and who was going to say no? And do you think when they went through that expense report in payables, when they were going through, that they were going to say one thing to him about the fact that there were 2 people on that expense report? And do you know that second person on that airline ticket was not his wife? And the only reason we know is because the tickets were attached. All right? So nobody said anything.
Now, can you go to the guy above him?
Well, we did. We reported the findings. And what they did with it, we don't know, because once they hired us to come in, do the audits we did, and we left. No idea what happened after that. My guess is he got a slap on the wrist, because he wasn't fired. I know that. So my guess is he got a slap on the wrist and said, you shouldn't be doing that. This is a publicly held company that, I don't want to say anything more, but basically they could get in a lot of trouble, so he shouldn't be doing that.
Or whoever was cutting the check?
Whoever was cutting the check, I mean, they probably could have gotten in trouble, but my guess is they're not very high level, and that in that situation they would have been scared. And it wasn't even the person cutting the check, because the person cutting the check would have been issued saying, issue this person's, reimbursement for $2,300. It's the person that reviewed the expense report saying it's okay to cut the check, which was him.
Well, right.
So there needed to be another control. Someone else, Now, was the person cutting the check looking at him going, God, these expense reports are high? So it should have been caught. So that one was fun, though. All right, and compliance may deteriorate over time. Yeah, well, kind of. So obviously this was one that probably wasn't, was okay at the beginning. And then my guess is what happened is he started probably pushing the limits. Maybe at the beginning, this individual that went with him went and he paid for her own way and just took her to dinner a couple times. And then, gradually started and realized nobody's checking these. I'm going to sign my own expense report. I sign my own expense report. Well, next time I'm going to pay for airfare. And just kind of upped it. So they definitely, internal controls definitely deteriorate over time if you do not go in there and revamp them. And the other thing that really does help, it's kind of like in public accounting when you have a turnover every 5 years of partners. All right, every 5 years the partners usually rotate off a client. They do that for a lot of reasons. But if you do that internally too and you have a change, it kind of freshens things up and it gets a new set of eyes on what's going on in that department. You can't always do that. It's not always feasible to do it in companies because you don't necessarily have that big a department or you don't have new people coming in the door. But when you can do it, it does provide that little breath of fresh air. All right, risk management systems, they were kind of, the COSO environment came in 2004. It was a big deal when it first came into play. It didn't replace the original one. It just kind of goes above and beyond for auditing standards. And basically kind of helps manage the risk in an organization. So how do we plan an audit? All right, we plan the audit. We go out there, the first thing we do is what we've just been talking about. We obtain an understanding of the environment, which is what we have talked about in Chapter 1. Then we kind of went to Chapter 2, went to Chapter 5, kind of went back to Chapters 3 and 4, kind of understanding what we're looking at. Right? What's the environment look like? What's the tone at the top? What's the risks? What's the ethical environment? Then we go in and we determine the risk from a statement and we design the audit procedures. Then we got to get into the actual perform the audit procedures, which we haven't done yet. Complete the audit and form an opinion. Now, why are we doing all this? If we don't understand how the internal control environment is set up, it is very hard for the auditor to be able to go in and perform an audit with any type of accuracy. All right, that internal control environment and the background for how a company and how the financial area is going to be set up. So if we don't know how the controls are operating, then we don't know how their day-to-days should be set up. Because the other thing is, even if we go in there if we went in there without looking at any internal control environment, we don't know what they should be expected to do. And by knowing what we want them to do, if they're not doing it, that kind of helps us understand what they could be circumventing, which gives us an idea of what type of individual we're dealing with. Are they circumventing it because they're wanting to? Are they circumventing it because they don't know how to do it the right way? Or are they circumventing it because maybe the control isn't what they thought it was? I mean, so we first got to go in. Every time we go in, internal controls are not necessarily full, like they have to do a certain way. All right, that's not necessarily it. So sometimes maybe the internal controls aren't set up right. Maybe we need to go in and say, this is not the way you should be doing it. Companies do need to sometimes be told by the auditors, this is not the right way you want to be doing this, especially if they haven't had an audit done in a very long time. All right. So auditors have to consider all 5 components, and they have to also look at the areas that are very difficult to monitor. And remember that while you're going in to assess and give an opinion on the overall financial environment, that by going in and being able to offer assistance and advice in other areas outside of just telling them how the financial statements look, you're now providing them with a service they weren't expecting. And if you can provide them with a service they weren't expecting by offering them advice on something else, that's what's going to bring you back as an auditor next time. By saying, you know, the way you guys are doing this is really hard. Have you ever thought of doing it this way? And then they're like, oh, you just saved me 20 minutes a day in the way I was doing it. Or this internal control is really old. You know, we don't do this anymore. How about doing it this way? Or if you're good at computers and you can go in and show the computer guy who maybe isn't that good at computers because he's not a computer guy. He was just told, this is your job. And now he's the computer guy. You know, the smaller the company, the more that happens. So those are things to look for. All right, so when we go to the procedures, and we start with talking to, when we're looking at the audit again, talking with the personnel. It's the first thing you do. Go in there, you talk to them, you sit down, You inquire, you ask what's going on, you talk to them, you ask how the environment's set up, you ask for the different procedures, you ask how everything, you ask how many people they have. You literally go into their office and you might talk to them for an hour. Depending on if it's the first time, you might talk to them for a day. You might start with the CFO, then go to the different HR manager, the payroll manager, the accounts payable manager, depends on how many layers they have. You would also want to go to the CIO or the director of IT if they don't have a CIO. Right. After that, then you're going to go observe the different applications. And there, when I say observe, it just depends on what they're running. It doesn't mean that you're going to go into the IT room, go into the computer room and look around, but you're going to go to possibly do like a walk around, see what people are doing as they work. Then you're going to start doing the inspection of the documents. Then you're going to trace it, and you might also do some type of evidence of effectiveness of the various controls, depending on the extent of the audit. And we've actually looked at a few of these, but they actually did have a few in your book. So on page 268, they had a questionnaire. So this is what a questionnaire kind of looked like. And this questionnaire, let me blow it up because I can't even read. So this questionnaire is over the cash receipts. And then the first question, it says, are all persons receiving or dispersing cash bonded? All right. And the first, they say yes. And then it says, are all incoming mail opened by a responsible person who does not have access to accounting records? And then it says no. And then it says it's a major weakness. And then it says why. And then it says Ellis is the head bookkeeper. Right, so obviously that person who's getting the cash can actually record the cash. Does employees assigned to opening incoming mail prepare a list of the checks? It says no, minor, see mitigating control. So now obviously as they're going through this checklist, when they're first saying yes or no, they don't know the note necessarily to the right. Sometimes they will know. They can actually say right away that this guy Ellis is whatever because the person telling them is going to be able to do that. They might not know there's a mitigating control, or they might put in the notes right away there is a mitigating control, but they're going to have to go find out what it is. And so then they go on down the line, and even down at the very bottom, notice there's plenty that are not applicable. So the questionnaire itself is a pretty generic questionnaire. So it can go from site to site to site with you. And then you have to go in then and mark the ones that apply to you. So that's an example of a questionnaire. And like it says in here, standardized. If you're looking at more of the narrative, which I showed you an example before, this is just their cash receipts procedure. Very short, to the point, tells you who wrote it, and it gives you the date. It's just a quick narrative of how they do something. And the reason what this is doing is it's not just writing up what's being done, it's telling you as the auditor what's being done. Because the only way you're going to get this information is by asking. And then it's in the notes. So then in next year's audit, this whole process, you go back and you're like, you can actually send them the narratives and say, has anything changed? In which they can make notes on it. But then this is what you can plan your audit on. You can go back in and say all checks are received by mail, the cashier picks it up, blah, 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 it's unopened, Ellen distributes the mail, you kind of pull out the important things. So what's the important thing? Martin then inputs them into the application. So one person receives them, a different person inputs them into the batch. That's one of the things we're going to be looking for. Whoever opens it is not the person putting it into the batch. And then it goes on to say, duplicate, Martin deposits the check. So the person, Martin, puts it in and then deposits them. All right, they return it. with duplicate, and then Ellis, so we go back to the person. So Martin deposits them, and we lose. Martin deposits them, but then it is someone else who then goes in and does do the cash, the bank reconciliation. So that helps. I think that just pulled in here. Let's see.
268.
Was it what?
268.
Almost there. There we go. And then any chargebacks are given to Ellis, by Ellis to the manager. So then if anything comes back, it's given to the manager. So there's your steps. You kind of got 3 different people involved. So next year when you come back in, you're looking for 3 different people. Will it be the same people? Maybe not. When we wrote our narratives, we were always encouraged to leave names out, but to put positions. That way, I wasn't coming in looking for Lorraine. I was looking in for cashier. But a lot of that's just the way that your audit firm writes the narratives. All right, the next thing they talk about is a flow chart. I can honestly tell you I haven't done a flow chart in a very, very, very long time. But hopefully you guys all know what a flow chart looks like. There's your beautiful little flow chart symbols. And here's an example of cash receipts. Might have to zoom this one out. There you go. Cash receipts using a flow chart. Now, it's all preference. I would rather have a narrative than a flow chart. I would rather write a narrative than do a flow chart. But there are flow charting programs now, so maybe it doesn't take near as long to do a flow chart as it used to take me. But when I was in college, we had to use like little Etch-a-Sketch die things to do flow charts. There wasn't we didn't have computers in every room like we do now. I'm old. You know, I had to go to the computer lab that had like 15 Macintoshes in it to do my computer. So I did not like flow charting. We did a lot of flow charting. I would rather write a narrative. And to me, the nice thing about a narrative is you can give it to anybody. You give someone outside the financial world, or even you give some financial people this, or you give a younger person this, and they're going to look at you like you have 4 heads. You give them a narrative, and they're going to be able to edit it. But if you give them this and say, what's changed, they're going to be able to read the words, but they're not going to know what that box means. You're going to have to give them a key, and then they're still going to be a little confused. So you're better off giving them a narrative. And then the last thing was the walkthrough. I don't think they didn't have an example of that, but we actually already kind of went through one of those, I believe. Didn't I show you the walkthrough that I had? Am I sleeping? When I went through, because I thought we did, because Brown Smith Wallace I thought did the same type of walkthrough in risk assessment paper or testing papers. Or did I not have a walkthrough? Yeah. Okay. I thought I had a walkthrough too, but basically it traced one transaction through. So basically you start with one transaction, and you're doing accounts receivable, and you just take accounts receivable from start to finish. It's very similar to a narrative. It's just much more detail, and it's a step-by-step. It's not a paragraph. It's where do I start? It starts here, then what happens? And it's more of a bullet-pointed item. All right. Wrong one. Let me bring this back over here. I thought after this one, there was one question in the homework. I was not going to have you guys flowchart. Just to kind of, let's break this up for a second, because even I'm getting tired of talking. Okay, so on page 291, do you have your book on there? Yeah. Okay. On 291, question 29, we'll kind of right at that part for that question. It talks about adherence to generally accepted auditing standards and being understanding existing internal controls, and it talks about different approaches. So take a second, and it says discuss advantages to CPAs documenting internal control by using the 3 different things we just talked about. And then think about question B. And then take a second just to kind of think about that, and then we'll talk about it. We're not gonna do a flow chart.